Hello, we are Team One Brain Cell. My name is Ryan, and my teammates are Arjun and Anthony. We created Blackjack using MATLAB.
The things I worked on were the deck class, the ThingSpeak, and the YouTube.
I worked on the GUI, the card class, and the YouTube video.
I worked on the hand class and the sound incorporation.
For the hand class function, we have three different variables in which we have the myCards, number of num cards, and the total score. The myCards function is the cards that are present in a player's hand during the game. The num cards is the number of cards that are in a player's hand. And lastly, the total score is the total amount of cards that a player has in which they add up to. We next have the hand function, which is basically the construction of the hand in which the player has all the cards during the game. We then have the reset hand function in which this identifies when a player has no cards and the game has begun or ended. We next have the add card function in which it checks whether a card has a suit of values, such as it being a hearts, or whether it has a value such as 2. We then have the myCards array in which it's an array that adds the card to the end of the array and will add it to the player's hand during the game. Next, we have a function that checks for an ace and determines whether the value is 1 or 11 based on the player's choice. We then have another function which is remove card, in which it takes away the cards of a player and starts the game over again. This lets the game know whether the player has no cards in their hand. Next, we have the find card function, which looks for any players that are present in a player's hand whenever they are playing the game Blackjack. Next, we have the isEmpty function, which checks whether the player has no cards in their hand. And then we have the print hand function, which shows all the cards that are present in the player's hand during the game, in which the other player is able to see it as well. And then lastly, for the hand function, the hand class, we have the total score function, which calculates the score based on whether a player has an ace or not, and adds the value of the cards that are present in their hand at a time.
And now Anthony will be showing us the card class.
In our project, in the hand class, we have the properties of a card. It has the values A through king and suits spades, hearts, clubs, and diamonds. And then we have the other properties, the value, suits, and score. And then image path for another property, so it'll lead to the directory of the card. In our first method, we have the card constructor. And it checks if there are two parameters, and checks if it is a valid suit and a valid value. Otherwise, it will create a card of that suit and value. These are the defaults of the card if it does not have a valid suit or value. Another function we have here is the compare to. It checks if the card is empty value or suit. Otherwise, it will have a false boolean. We have a print card function here. It'll just print the card depending on what the value and suit it has. Another method we have here are the helper ones. Checks if it's a valid suit and then a valid value here. We was used earlier in the class. These are getters, getter functions. Get score. Checks if index is 10, otherwise the score will be 10. And these are for the ace, in case of the ace. Otherwise, it's not a valid score, which would be negative infinity. For the value to string function, it checks if it's a number from 2 to 10, because those are valid numbers and not letters. In these cases, it's an ace through king, otherwise it's an unknown value. And here's a suit to string. S for spade, heart for hearts, and C for clubs, and D for diamonds, otherwise it's an unknown suit.
Now we'll be looking at the deck class. So first we set the private properties as number of cards and the deck, and the hidden and private properties as score per bit. And now we're looking at the deck function, which checks if the number of arguments in is 0, then it sets the number of decks is equal to 1. And next we have the deal card function, which the whole purpose of this was how we're going to find a way to deal the card. And what it does, it finds the deck, and it makes sure that whenever you deal a card is removed from the deck, which we defined before. And Now we have the shuffle function, and it basically, first of all, it checks whether it's empty or not, and then it uses the randperm function, which is creates a random permutation of the values within the array and make sure that none of them are repeated again, so that they're just in a different order. And then we use the for loop when we define a new deck. The I location in the new deck is equal to the obj deck, and that's how. And then we define obj deck is equal to the new deck, and that's how we use our shuffle function. And next we want to have our print deck here, which is just we first use our fprintf for the deck, which is standard, and then we do a for loop for the number of cards again, which prints that out again. And afterwards, where it's just another, it uses the shuffle function again, and we end up with the end of the deck function.
Here in the Blackjack GUI code of the game, the deck hand, player 1 and player 2 is initialized, and here is the initialization of the board, creation of the board, the hit button, the stand button, the labels, and then the drop-down menu for the player selection according to the amount of players are wanted. It could be 1 player or 2 players. And then here is the creation of a new game. Call into the new game function right under it. In the new game function, it will just create a new game, setting the scores to 0, and a new deck if there are not enough cards. And then the buttons are enabled, and then a creation of a new hand. The new hand function will just reset the hand, and then the player will be given 2 cards. The player change function will create a new game every time the drop-down menu is used, as the number of players will be changed. Show cards will just show the card that is called to. Subplot type will change the size of the cards so that it will fit on the screen. The calculate points function will calculate the amount of points that a player has in their hand according to the values that it has in total. Checkpoints will check the amount of points a player has, and then we'll change the labels accordingly. Hit cards will generate a card to a player's hand, and then checks if, as long as the deck is not empty, will be given a card to the player, and then we'll check the amount of points that a player has at the end. Play dealer will be used for the 1 player selection, and as it will act as an AI or a CPU in this case. Create a new hand, and then continuously play on its own until it will not bust. Here in the stand card function, it will calculate all the possible scenarios according to whatever the scores are after the player hits the stand card button. And here's the ThingSpeak function that Arjun will explain right now.
Now we can look at the send to ThingSpeak function. So basically what I'm doing here is that I use the format given to us by ThingSpeak with all of the variables and make sure that all the data that we need is sent to ThingSpeak using the given channel ID and the given channel key. And here we can see that in ThingSpeak itself, we have the scores listed, which is just the exact same scores from the demonstration that Anthony's provided. And here we see we have 3 different charts. One is for the single player scores, one is for the multiplayer player 1, and one's for multiplayer player 2. I feel like these values can be quite useful in terms of seeing when the player is about to either go over and bust, or when they plan to stand. So it can be good data for a blackjack player to use.